Hey everyone, and welcome to today's Explainer. Get ready, because today we are exploring a really fascinating, highly structured philosophical text by an author named Zhu Feng. It literally lays out a complete evolutionary timeline of human civilization. We're talking about tracking the whole human journey, from the absolute darkest parts of our history all the way forward into a theoretical, perfectly harmonious future. It's this massive, sweeping architectural framework of how human thought has developed, and maybe even more importantly, what's actually holding us back right now. Okay, let's dive into this. If I just came up to you and asked, hey, do you think we're still living in an age of superstition? Your first instinct would probably be to point at your smartphone or, I don't know, the International Space Station and say, no way, of course not. We live in the age of science, right? But the central premise of the text we're analyzing today flips that completely on its head. It argues that despite literally all of our modern scientific development, these hidden, evolved superstitions are still running completely rampant. In fact, the author argues that these modern superstitions are the absolute root causes of all our current social turbulence. So, to figure out how we get out of this mess, the text says we first really need to understand exactly where we came from. Part 1. Humanity's Dark Past, a History of Chaos and Conflict. Looking backward to the very first stage of this chronological framework, I've got to say, this source text pulls absolutely no punches. The author views our history through an incredibly stark lens, using this rhythmic, almost poetic repetition to really drive the point home. Listen to this. According to the text, the past of humanity is a history of sufferings and conflicts. The past of humanity is a manifestation of animal instincts. The past of humanity is driven by selfishness. The past of humanity is a history of chaos, of competing giants and religions constantly warring for position. And finally, the past of humanity is simply a history of wickedness. Yeah, so the author leaves absolutely zero room for romanticizing the quote-unquote good old days. The text states clearly, the past of humanity is a history of selfishness, a history of survival of the fittest. The argument here is absolute. The past was just this dark, barbaric era, governed entirely by the law of the jungle. For the author, it is an era completely unworthy of our remembrance, and it is certainly unworthy of our emulation. That brings us to part 2, the transitional present, moving towards rationality. The text views our current era as this sort of awkward transitional phase, right? We're moving away from barbarism, but we are totally stuck. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is how the author uniquely redefines the word superstition. When you or I hear that word, we usually think of, avoiding black cats or not walking under ladders, stuff like that. But the source text expands this definition dramatically. Here, superstition is defined as any fanatical belief, any rigid dogma, or any blind faith that suppresses human nature and rationality. And under this incredibly broad definition, the author actually categorizes 8 specific modern superstitions that are holding humanity back right now. So let's break them down. Part 3. Superstitions of Belief, Religion and Academic Blindness. So the first group in our taxonomy of the present revolves entirely around the rigid systems of belief that we tend to cling to. The text argues that fanatical religious belief is, at its core, a blinding superstition. Why? Well, because as the author points out, these systems often arrogantly claim absolute exclusivity. It's that idea of my religion is the absolute only right one, and all the others are evil. The text neutrally but very firmly asserts that this kind of fanatical belief is always built on emotional impulse rather than rational choice. And as long as this exclusivity exists, the text argues it's just going to inevitably suppress human nature and make war and suffering completely unavoidable. But hold on, because the author doesn't just stop at religion. Academic blind faith is also on the chopping block here. The text makes a really interesting point that human knowledge progresses in waves. A specific theory might be an amazing symbol of progress for its specific time, but it is not the ultimate truth. If we blindly cling to just one academic conclusion, we're basically binding our own thoughts. The author argues we've got to avoid this so we can actually reach an ideal intellectual state, a situation famously described as 100 flowers blossoming and 100 schools of thought contending. Moving right along to part 4, Superstitions of Identity, Nationalism and Hero Worship. Now for our next category, the text offers this quirky but honestly highly effective fruit metaphor to critique nationalism. Every nation out there has its own unique advantages, right? Just like different fruits have their own unique tastes. And this brilliantly illustrates the point. If a watermelon and a peach start thinking that they are the absolute best, and that literally all other fruit should be eliminated to form some sort of monomode, well, that is just extreme overbearing arrogance. The text argues that national pride is not some divine trait. Rather, it creates discrimination and barriers, and ultimately destroys human nature. Therefore, nationalism itself is a superstition. Closely tied to that whole nationalism idea is our deep obsession with identity figures. The source details two types of identity worship that we need to watch out for. The first is the frantic worship of the quote-unquote great, so treating national founders and heroes not just with normal respect, but as infallible saviors or even gods. The text explicitly calls this crossing the limit into a mania, and even refers to it as a mental illness that guarantees a vicious cycle of suffering. The second type is the worship of masters. People with incredibly unique, foresighted wisdom in specific fields. Respecting a master? Totally fine. But blindly worshiping them? That becomes an infectious virus. Actually, the author uses this really beautiful, astronomical metaphor to explain exactly why this is so dangerous. A great master is like a shining star in the giant sky of human history. That's great. But if a society starts treating that one master like the sun, revolving eternally around just them, the blinding glare of that sun is going to cover up all the other stars. If we blindly worship just one genius, the text argues, a nation will literally have no successors. Part 5. Superstitions of the supernatural. Seeking the extraordinary. Transitioning to our final category of present-day superstitions, the text takes a hard look at the occult. And it delivers this striking and honestly kind of hilarious quote. A potato cannot become a tomato. What the author means here is that ordinary people waste just massive amounts of time, energy, and intellect trying to unlock these extraordinary, supernatural powers. It's like trying to somehow grow an extra head or extra arms. It's just not going to happen. The text argues that trying to force yourself to become something way outside of natural human limits just plunges you right into a mud of self-deceiving, where you eventually lose your way entirely. To further explain this supernatural category, the text actually makes several really specific theological claims. It argues that human DNA has strict natural limits and that true supernatural wisdom is only held by specific beings who were reincarnated with special missions. Just to impartially report the text's exact theological stance here, the author asserts that, as far as humanity is concerned, there are only two gods, Jesus and Satan. Therefore, humans going around creating and titling any brand new gods is, you guessed it, pure superstition. Furthermore, the text claims that advertising ghosts in our media is this huge historical retrogression that's totally incompatible with modern civilization. Oh, and attempting to communicate with the spirit world without first achieving perfect human nature, the text says that will always lead humanity astray. Part 6. A Harmonious Future. The Evolution of Reason. All right, having identified all these tricky ideological traps, we can finally look at the entire architectural timeline that summarizes the source text's framework. So the crucial point is really seeing this big picture. First, the past, an era entirely ruled by religion and barbaric superstition. Second, our present, this weird, transitional, chaotic era where modern science is awkwardly combined with all those lingering fanatical religions and modern superstitions we literally just discussed. And finally, the future, an evolved era where science and religion finally mix harmoniously together, guided purely by the brilliant light of rationality and reason. The source text offers a really clear roadmap, doesn't it? But it also leaves us with an incredibly profound challenge. As you look at the world around you today, at our politics, our institutions, our pop culture, our media, consider the author's taxonomy of superstitions. Are they still there? Will humanity ever truly step into that light of reason outlined in the text? Or are we just destined to keep inventing new superstitions to blindly worship? It's definitely a question worth asking ourselves as we try to navigate this crazy transitional present. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and as always, keep questioning the world around you.